There's this powerful pull in us, ain't there? That craving for now. A quick comfort, a shiny new thing, a feeling we've earned. Most folks answer that call. But sometimes what you grab today steals from the tomorrow you truly need. There was a man named Clayton who learned that truth. Clayton was 42, punching the clock at the auto parts factory. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred, told tales of heavy steel and endless shifts, a permanent oil smudge under the nails. His face was etched with lines from too many early alarms, deep-set eyes weary but sharp, familiar with tough winters. Clay was a quiet man. Stoic, reliable, he rarely offered an opinion, just moved with a steady, persistent hum, carrying his daily weight. His daily weight was a well-worn rhythm, a tune played on a broken record. The 5 a.m. alarm was a screeching bird, not a wake-up call, but a reminder of another gray dawn. He'd swing his feet to the cold linoleum, the pattern on the floor worn smooth in the path from bed to bathroom. The small, single-story house in the working-class suburb, built back in the 70s, it was his. Not much, but it was his. Well-maintained, sure, because Clayton fixed what was broken, but dated all the same. The beige walls had seen better days. The carpet in the living room held the ghosts of 1,000 spilled snacks and muddy boots. He'd slip into his work clothes, the same faded jeans, the same sturdy flannel shirt, smelling faintly of last night's dinner and industrial grease. Sarah, his wife, she'd be up too, moving with a quiet efficiency, making coffee that tasted like salvation and packing his lunch. He'd grab a quick, silent breakfast, the clink of his spoon against the bowl the loudest sound in the early morning kitchen. Emily, his 14-year-old, would still be lost in teenage slumber, and Josh, just 10, dreaming of superheroes and adventures that didn't involve factory floors. Then came the commute, the familiar growl of his 15-year-old truck, another silent partner in his daily grind. The same cracked pavement, the same gas station coffee, the same skeletal trees reaching up to a sky that rarely felt blue. And then the factory. The air thick with the metallic tang of machinery, the incessant hum and clatter that became a second heartbeat. He'd walk the floor, past the presses, the drills, the assembly lines, a cog in a vast, greasy machine. His job wasn't complicated, but it demanded precision, demanded focus, demanded his hands and his back and the slow drain of his spirit 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. He worked hard, never complained. That was Clayton's way. Just kept his head down, pushed the heavy parts, checked the gauges, bolted the components. Each piece moved, assembled, shipped out. A product, a number, a paycheck that felt like it was already spent before it even hit his bank account. And that was the real weight. Not the steel parts he lifted, but the invisible burden of bills, the mortgage payment due on the 3rd, the electricity soaring in winter, the car insurance that always seemed to creep up. Groceries that cost more each month, school supplies for Emily and Josh, a new pair of shoes for Sarah when her old ones finally gave out. He'd sit at the chipped kitchen table after dinner, the kids doing homework, Sarah clearing dishes, and he'd spread the envelopes out like a bad hand of cards. Shuffle, reshuffle, try to find a winning combination. Always just enough. Barely. He wasn't a man for grand luxuries. He didn't dream of yachts or mansions. His desires were simple. A new furnace that didn't clank and groan, maybe a vacation to a lake where Josh could fish all day, a little college fund for Emily so she wouldn't have to start life already behind. But those desires felt like dreams of another man from another world. They were always just out of reach, shimmering like heat haze on a summer road, disappearing as he got closer. Inside that quiet, stoic man beneath the calm surface, there was a constant, low-grade thrum of worry. It was like a faulty motor in the basement of his mind, always running, always reminding him of what he didn't have, of what he couldn't give. He saw the world through a practical lens, sure, but he also saw the gap between where he was and where he desperately wanted to be. He remembered a younger Clayton, a kid with rough hands and bright ideas, fresh out of high school. He'd toyed with the idea of community college, maybe learning a trade that didn't just break your back but built something more permanent. An electrician, maybe, or running his own small garage. But life, as it often does, had a way of steamrolling those tender ambitions. Sarah came along, then Emily, then Josh. And with them, love, yes, a love so deep it ached, but also a responsibility so heavy it pinned him to the factory floor. He loved his family fiercely, but that love was also the sharpest edge of his inner torment. He wanted to be their rock, their provider, the man who smoothed their path. Instead, he felt like he was just barely keeping their heads above water, constantly treading, never quite reaching solid ground. He saw the flicker of disappointment in Emily's eyes when he said, "Maybe next year." to a school trip or a new pair of jeans that weren't from the discount rack. He heard Josh's innocent questions about why they couldn't get the latest video game console like his friends, each one a small, invisible stab. He'd internalize it all. That was his flaw. He wasn't one to sit down and pour out his heart, not even to Sarah. What was there to say? "I'm scared we won't make it. I'm worried about the future." Those words felt like admissions of weakness, not honest feelings. He'd just press his lips into a thin line, nod, and go back to calculating. More overtime, another weekend shift. Just grind harder, push through. That was his solution, his only strategy. And it was wearing him down, leaving him perpetually exhausted, always playing catch-up, always feeling like he was falling just a little bit short. The quiet ambition that burned within him wasn't for glory, it was for safety, for peace, for the simple, profound ability to say yes to his kids without a knot of dread tightening in his gut. He worried about old age, about what would happen if the factory shut down, about an unexpected medical bill. He worried that his hard work, his endless effort, was merely keeping him on a treadmill and not actually moving him forward. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong, but they felt tied, unable to build the future he truly envisioned, trapped by the demands of the immediate, the relentless pull of now. He wanted more, he deserved more, but wishing for it he knew wasn't enough. It never was. The weight of financial instability was a constant companion, a shadow that followed him even into his dreams. He'd wake up sometimes, heart pounding, convinced he'd forgotten to pay a bill, only to realize it was just the phantom grip of anxiety. He saw other men at the factory, some older, some younger, caught in the same cycle. Living paycheck to paycheck, their pay raises swallowed by inflation, their bonuses spent before they received them. And he'd always told himself he was different, that he'd break free. But the evidence of his life, his small house, his old truck, his perpetually stretched budget, suggested otherwise. He was stuck, and the fear of remaining stuck, of watching his kids inherit the same struggle, was a silent scream in the quiet corners of his mind. He carried it all deep down, a heavy, secret burden. The sun wasn't even a rumor in the sky when Clayton's alarm ripped through the quiet of his small bedroom. 5 a.m. Always 5 a.m. It was an old clock, the kind with glowing orange digits and a buzz like a trapped hornet, a relic from a time when he hadn't thought much about replacing things until they outright failed. He slapped it silent, the motion practiced, a part of the pre-dawn ritual that had governed his life for the better part of 2 decades. He swung his legs out of bed, the floor cold under his feet even through his worn socks. Sarah stirred beside him, a soft murmur of protest, but didn't wake fully. He appreciated that. It gave him these few minutes of solitary peace, a sliver of time before the house hummed to life with the rustle of kids and the clatter of breakfast. He moved like a shadow through the familiar layout of their home, a single story built in the early 70s, well-maintained but dated, every creak in the floorboards a familiar note in the symphony of his waking. The scent of stale coffee from yesterday's forgotten grounds mingled with the faint, sweet smell of his daughter Emily's teenage perfume seeping from her closed door. A quick shower, scalding hot to chase away the morning chill, then into the familiar uniform. Sturdy work pants, a thick flannel shirt over a t-shirt, steel-toed boots. He made his own coffee, strong and black, and ate a piece of toast standing by the kitchen counter, scanning the day-old newspaper for anything beyond the local headlines. Most mornings there wasn't. Just the same world, spinning on, oblivious to the quiet worries churning in a factory worker's gut. The drive to the plant was a blur of pre-dawn streetlight and the hum of his truck's aging engine. He knew every pothole, every turn, every shadow cast by the towering power lines. The plant itself was a monster of corrugated steel and concrete, exhaling plumes of steam into the cold morning air. Inside, it was a symphony of controlled chaos. The rhythmic clang of presses, the hiss of hydraulic lines, the rumble of conveyor belts carrying raw materials and finished goods. He was a machine operator running a heavy press that stamped out parts for agricultural equipment. Repetitive work, precise work, requiring focus but demanding little thought once the rhythm was learned. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred, moved with practiced efficiency, loading metal sheets, hitting the button, watching the giant ram descend with a deafening thud. Every thud, every part stamped, was a number in his head. $1, $1.50, sometimes 2. He could feel the vibration of the press in his bones, a dull ache that started in his shoulders and settled in his lower back by the end of the shift. He'd learned to ignore it, just like he ignored the constant hum in his ears and the faint metallic taste that seemed to cling to the air. What he couldn't ignore was the constant mental ledger he kept, the tally of his earnings against the rising tide of bills, mortgage, utilities, groceries, the kids' school expenses. The nagging feeling that the old furnace was on its last legs or that one of the truck's tires was looking a little too bald. He'd watch Emily and Josh, their faces bright with the simple hopes of childhood, and a different kind of ache would settle in his chest. A deeper one. They deserved more than just getting by. They deserved to not have to worry about school trips or new sneakers. He wanted them to have choices, opportunities he hadn't. He wanted to give them a launch pad, not the same treadmill he found himself on. He remembered dreaming once, years ago, of opening his own small welding shop, of being his own boss, shaping metal into something useful and beautiful by his own design. But the startup costs, the risk, the thought of pulling money away from his family, it had seemed like an impossible luxury, a foolish fantasy. So he'd buried it, deep under layers of responsibility and the daily grind, telling himself it was for the best. Sometimes, in the brief lulls between loading sheets of metal, his eyes would drift to the smudged window high above the factory floor, to a patch of sky turning from bruised purple to pale gray. He'd wonder if he was just another cog, destined to spin in place until he wore out. The stoic exterior he presented to the world, the man who worked hard, didn't complain, just got the job done, was a shield. Beneath it, his ambition hadn't died, it had just taken root underground, twisting and gnawing at him like a persistent weed. He longed for the security, the peace of mind he'd promised himself and his family. He yearned to see that spark of hope in his children's eyes, knowing he could meet their needs, not just their basic ones, but their dreams too. The gap between that burning desire and his daily reality felt like a chasm he couldn't bridge. And that chasm, wide and deep, was what truly haunted Clayton, more than any unpaid bill ever could. It was the fear of a life half-lived, of potential left to rot, of being the man who simply endured when deep down he knew he was capable of so much more. He kept it all locked away, a heavy secret even from Sarah, because admitting the depth of his despair felt like admitting defeat. The chasm, however, didn't always stay buried. Sometimes it'd yawn open, quick and brutal, like a sinkhole in soft earth. It happened one Tuesday evening, a memory seared into him like a brand. Dinner was over, the usual clatter of forks on plates, Sarah clearing the table while Josh argued with his sister over a game. Emily, his oldest, the one with her mother's smarts and a quiet, watchful way about her, brought it up. "Dad." She started, her voice a little brighter than usual, pushing her history textbook aside on the worn kitchen table. "MS, Evans told us about the class trip again." Clayton grunted, reaching for his coffee mug. "Oh yeah, where's she dragging you kids this time?" He tried to sound light, interested, but inside, a familiar tension began to coil. School trips always meant money. "It's to the Natural History Museum downtown." Emily explained, her eyes wide with an excitement that made his stomach clench. "And a sleepover at the Science Center afterwards. We get to see the dinosaur exhibit, and they have this new planetarium show. Everyone's going. It sounds really cool, Dad." He watched her, this girl on the cusp of womanhood, trying to hold on to the wonder of childhood. A warmth spread through him, a fierce protective love. He wanted to give her the world. He just couldn't, not yet. He asked for the details, the flyer she pulled from her backpack, crisp and official. His eyes scanned the bold print, past the glowing descriptions of educational enrichment, straight to the bottom. The cost, a number that, while not astronomical, felt like a punch to the gut. $185. For a museum trip and an overnight stay, Clayton felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He knew, without even having to check, what their bank account looked like. He knew what bills were due that week. He knew what was left after rent, groceries, and the truck payment. There was no extra, no wiggle room, not a dime. The only place that kind of money existed was in their emergency fund, the meager, hard-won few $100 they'd managed to squirrel away for actual emergencies, like a broken water heater or an unexpected car repair. Dipping into that for a school trip. It felt reckless, a betrayal of the tiny sliver of security they had. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. That's a bit of money, Em," he said, trying to soften the blow. He looked at Sarah, who had paused, her back to him, as if sensing the weight in his voice. She glanced over her shoulder, a silent question in her eyes. Emily's smile faltered just a touch, her brow furrowed, a shadow passing over her face. "But everyone's going, Dad." "It's a really important trip for History Class 2, MS," Evans said. "We're doing a project on it." Her voice was smaller now, the excitement dimming, replaced by a nascent plea. And there it was, that look, the one he dreaded, the one that tore at him more than any scolding ever could. The slight downturn of her lips, the quick, almost imperceptible sag of her shoulders, the way her gaze dropped from his to the flyer on the table. It wasn't anger, not resentment. It was something far worse, disappointment, a quiet, resigned disappointment that hit him squarely in the chest. He saw the fleeting hope in her eyes extinguish like a match snuffed out in the wind. In that instant, time seemed to stretch and thin. He didn't just see Emily, he saw himself years ago wanting something, needing something, and being told again and again, "We can't afford it." But worse, he saw his own choices laid bare. That new fishing reel he bought last month because he deserved it. The impulse order for a fancier pizza than usual because he'd had a tough week. The unnecessary upgrade to the truck's sound system that was still on the credit card statement. Each little deserving impulse, each fleeting moment of comfort had chipped away at their future, at Emily's future, until there was nothing left for something as simple and meaningful as a school trip. His worn leather wallet, still in his back pocket from work, felt heavy, not with money, but with the weight of his failures. He thought of all the times he'd bought into the lie that he was owed something, that he deserved to spend his hard-earned cash on immediate gratification. It was a vicious cycle, one that left him perpetually broke, stressed about bills, and worst of all, unable to provide the very security and opportunities he craved for his family. He opened his mouth, wanting to promise, wanting to magically fix it, but no words came out. The silence in the kitchen, broken only by Josh's continued complaining in the next room, felt deafening. He looked at Emily's downcast face, then at his wallet, then back at her. And in that quiet, devastating moment, something snapped inside Clayton. An almost imperceptible shift, but one that felt like an earthquake in the bedrock of his soul. Things had to change. Vowed it then and there, a silent, desperate promise to himself. The house grew quiet around 11. Sarah was already asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Josh and Emily had been tucked in hours ago, their own worlds, whatever they held, put away until morning. But Clayton, he lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling, the shadows of the fan blades barely visible. His mind was a relentless factory floor, gears grinding, machines clanking, no off switch in sight. 3 a.m. That hour, the world feels thinnest then when the distractions of the day have receded and the brutal honesty of the night takes over. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and padded silently to the living room. The worn armchair, usually a comfort, felt cold and hard. He sat, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, gazing at nothing. What had his life become? A treadmill. A long, monotonous stretch of pavement where he just kept running, but never seemed to get anywhere. Every extra shift, every bonus, every small victory against the tide of bills, it all evaporated, leaving him right back where he started. No, worse than where he started. Because now the disappointment wasn't just his own. It was etched on Emily's face, a testament to his inability to make ends meet, to provide for the things that truly mattered. He replayed the scene in the kitchen, every inflection in Emily's voice, every subtle movement of her features, her excitement, her plea, her quiet resignation. It felt like a mirror held up to his soul, reflecting not the man he wanted to be, but the man he had become. Someone trapped by his own impulses, chained by a lifetime of "I deserve it." He'd always prided himself on being a good provider, a steady hand. But what good was a steady hand if it was always empty? A wave of shame washed over him, hot and bitter. He'd blamed circumstances, the economy, the low wages, the rising costs. But tonight there was nowhere to hide. Tonight, under the unforgiving gaze of the moon filtering through the blinds, he saw the real culprit. Himself. His own weakness for immediate gratification, his inability to say no to the fleeting desires that promised comfort but delivered only an illusion. He saw the years of small, seemingly insignificant choices that had added up like grains of sand to form the impenetrable wall between him and the secure future he longed for. He saw the gaping hole in his financial foundation, dug by his own hand, filled with the ghosts of impulse purchases. The fear, usually a low hum, now roared in his ears. What if the truck broke down and he did have to dip into that emergency fund, only there was nothing left? What if Sarah got sick? What if Josh needed something critical? What then? He was living on the edge, a few bad breaks away from losing everything. And it wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about peace of mind, about being able to look his children in the eye and promise them a future he truly believed he could deliver. The burning ambition he'd kept buried, the one for security and true provision, felt like it was finally choking on the ashes of his present reality. He was tired. Tired of the worry, tired of the scramble, tired of the hollow feeling after every impulsive purchase. Most of all, he was tired of being tired. He was tired. The words echoed in the hollow space behind his ribs. Not just tired from the grind of the factory floor or the constant hum of worry, but soul-tired. A deep weariness that settled in his bones and clung to his thoughts. He lay there, rigid, the faint smell of stale coffee and machine oil from his work clothes still clinging to the bedroom air. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic creak of the old house settling and the softer, more precious sounds of his family breathing in their sleep down the hall. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against them, trying to push away the images. Emily's face, the slight slump of her shoulders, the way she'd tried to hide her disappointment. It wasn't just a school trip. It was a crack in the foundation of trust, a moment where his unspoken promise to provide had wavered. That little girl, his daughter, deserved better than a father who couldn't swing a field trip because he'd chased every fleeting want like a dog after a dropped scrap. An abrupt, almost physical jolt went through him. Enough. The word wasn't spoken aloud, but it thundered inside his skull, a quiet, absolute declaration. Enough of the chasing, enough of the excuses, enough of the hollow, deserving that led to nothing but debt and dread. He didn't know how yet, didn't have a grand plan, no savings account magically appearing overnight. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut like a cold, hard stone that this particular way of living, this cycle of earn and spend, of yearning and regretting, was over. It had to be, for Emily, for Josh. For Sarah, who carried her own burdens with quiet strength. And yes, for himself, for the man he still believed he could be. He got up then, not to pace, but to simply sit on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning softly under his weight. The worn carpet felt rough beneath his bare feet. He looked out the window, past the thin curtain at the pre-dawn glow beginning to paint the sky a bruised purple. A new day was coming. And for the first time in a long time, the prospect of it wasn't just another repetition of the same struggle. It was a blank slate, an opportunity for a different kind of fight. The alarm shrilled at 5 a.m. Clayton moved with the practiced ease of a man who'd been rising before the sun for decades. Coffee machine on, lunch packed, work boots laced, same routine. But today there was a subtle tension in his movements, a new layer of resolve under the usual stoicism. His stomach rumbled faintly. He usually grabbed a pastry and a fancy coffee from the convenience store on the way to the factory. A small pleasure, a quick hit of sugar and caffeine to jumpstart the day. He considered it his earned reward for getting out of bed. He picked up his car keys. His hand hesitated. The convenience store was on the way, a beacon of immediate gratification. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries, the cheerful chime of the door, the brief interaction with the cashier, it was a habit etched deep. His mind offered up the usual justifications. It's just a few bucks. You work hard. You deserve it. The old voice, familiar and seductive, clawed at the edges of his resolve. But then Emily's face flashed in his mind, the school trip, the disappointment. He saw it again, stark and clear, eclipsing the image of the warm pastry. He heard his own quiet thundering. Enough. He took a breath, a slow, deliberate one that filled his lungs and settled his nerves. No pastry, no fancy coffee. He had coffee at home, black and strong, already in his thermos. He had a banana on the counter, left over from the kids' breakfast. It felt weird. A small ache, a phantom craving stirred in his gut. A tiny rebellion from his usual routine. The car started with a grumble. He drove past the convenience store, not even slowing down. His eyes stayed straight ahead, focused on the road, on the fading stars above the industrial park. He felt a faint tremor in his hands on the steering wheel, not from cold, but from the exertion of holding firm against a lifetime of habit. When he pulled into the factory lot, a wave of something unexpected washed over him. Not pride, not yet. More like a quiet, hard-won victory. A sense of having walked through a small fire and come out on the other side. His coffee was black and strong, and the banana was just a banana, nothing special. But the $2.50 he hadn't spent, they were still in his wallet. A tiny, almost insignificant sum, yet it felt like a fortune. It wasn't about the money itself, not yet. It was about the choice. It was the first brick laid in a new foundation, a silent testament to a promise made in the dark of night, a promise that today's small sacrifice would build tomorrow's security. This was day one. The first no that would eventually lead to a much bigger yes. Day one slipped into day two, then day three. The phantom ache in Clayton's gut didn't vanish, it just changed. It became a low thrum, a constant whisper of, just this once. Each morning, the car idled in the driveway, and his hand would hover over the radio dial, ready to turn on the morning show that usually had him chuckling, a momentary escape before the grind. But he'd promised himself he'd cut back on anything that wasn't essential, and that meant less mindless consumption, even of entertainment. So he listened to the quiet hum of the engine, the chirping of early birds, and the growing hum of his own thoughts. The coffee and banana routine became a silent ritual. Each sip of the strong, black brew, each bite of the bland fruit was a small defiance. His coworkers, old hands like him, noticed. "Clayton, you sick, buddy?" Frank from press asked one Tuesday morning, holding out a cruller from the box in the break room. "You ain't touched a donut in 3 days. What gives?" Clayton just shook his head, a tight smile on his face. "Nah, Frank, just trying something new." He didn't elaborate. Couldn't. How do you explain to a man who's been living paycheck to paycheck for 30 years that you're trying to outrun that very fate? That you're trying to build something out of nothing but discipline? Frank just shrugged and bit into his cruller, powdered sugar dusting his mustache. The smell of cinnamon and sugar hung in the air, a sweet, tempting cloud, making Clayton's stomach rumble with a longing that went deeper than just hunger. It was the longing for ease, for the old comfort. He clenched his jaw, grabbed his tools, and walked out to his station, the phantom taste of sweetness following him. By day 7, the novelty was long gone. It was just hard. The small victories felt smaller, the sacrifices felt heavier. He started noticing every little thing he denied himself. The new fishing lure he walked past at the hardware store, eyes lingering on the iridescent scales, remembering the joy on Josh's face when they caught that bass last summer. The new pair of work boots that would replace his worn-out ones, the ones whose soles were starting to feel the concrete through. He didn't need them yet, not really. His current boots still held together, though they bit a little at his heel by the end of a long shift. He'd save for them, he told himself. He'd save until he could buy them without a tremor of guilt or worry. The inner voice, the one that usually told him he deserved a break, started getting louder. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a growl. "You're working yourself to the bone, Clayton. What for?" "A few extra bucks. You could drop dead tomorrow. Enjoy it while you can." He'd come home exhausted, the metallic tang of the factory floor still in his nose, and the kids would be watching TV, Emily texting, Josh engrossed in a video game. Sarah would greet him with a tired smile, a plate of simple dinner already on the table. And in those moments, the temptation to just relax, to just stop thinking about money, was immense. To reach for that expensive craft beer he used to enjoy, to order a pizza on a Friday night, to just splurge, to feel normal again. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, he found himself staring at the online shopping cart on his phone. A new drill set, a decent one, he'd wanted it for years. He'd justify it, he reasoned. It was a tool, an investment in the house. He imagined the smooth hum of the motor, the clean bite into wood. His finger hovered over the buy now button, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The urge was so strong, so physical, it made his hands tremble. He was so close to giving in, to feeling that momentary rush of acquisition. Then, almost like a ghost, Emily's face floated into his mind, her slight shrug, the disappointment clouding her eyes when he'd told her about the school trip. The memory was a cold splash of water, an electric shock that snapped him back. He closed the browser, his breath catching in his throat. The drill set could wait. His kids couldn't. By day 14, he was raw. Every cell in his body screamed for ease, for the familiar comfort of instant gratification. He woke up with a dull ache behind his eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from the constant internal wrestling match. At lunch, he'd eat his brown bag sandwich, a little meager, he sometimes thought, compared to the loaded subs his coworkers brought, and stare blankly at the wall, trying to drown out the noise in his head. "Just one beer tonight, Clayton. You earned it. This ain't living." The voice was insidious, persuasive. He'd picture the cold condensation on a frosty bottle, the first bitter, sweet sip. He knew that one beer wouldn't hurt his savings much. But he also knew it wouldn't be just one beer. It would be the crack in the dam, the first stone he pulled out, letting the old habits flood back in. He saw the path, clear as day, leading straight back to where he was before, perpetually broke, perpetually stressed, perpetually disappointing. He saw Emily's face again, felt the pang. He closed his eyes, took a slow, shuddering breath, and swallowed the last bite of his simple sandwich. He hadn't failed. Not yet. The battle raged inside him, an unseen war, but he was still standing, still holding the line. Barely. By day 20, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with a sudden flash of insight, but like a heavy river stone slowly, imperceptibly, being worn smooth by the current. The insistent, nagging voice in his head, the one promising immediate comfort, urging him to spend, it hadn't gone away entirely. But it had lost some of its authority. It was less a roar, more a persistent whisper, easier to tune out. He started noticing small things. The way the early morning quiet felt different, less like a prelude to another day of drudgery and more like a space he could inhabit. He'd sit at the kitchen table with his instant coffee, not rushing, just observing the way the light hit the worn laminate countertop. Sarah, usually asleep when he left, had started waking up earlier too and would just watch him sometimes, a soft question in her eyes he couldn't quite answer yet. At the factory, the scent of metal and oil still clung to everything, but it didn't feel as oppressive. Still worked hard, but the exhaustion felt cleaner, less burdened by the weight of unaddressed financial dread. When Lenny from assembly offered him a piece of his extra-large pizza on break, Clayton just shook his head gently. "Nah, I'm good, Lenny. Thanks, though." Lenny, a man who believed in instant gratification with every bite, squinted at him. "You all right, Clay? You been passing on everything good lately." Clayton just gave a small shrug. "Just trying to watch what I eat." It was a partial truth, but it served. The real shift was internal. It wasn't about deprivation anymore. It was about choice. He was choosing the quiet satisfaction of seeing the numbers in his savings account creep up dollar by hard-earned dollar. He started checking it not with dread, but with a strange, burgeoning pride. Each new digit was a small victory, a tiny monument to a temptation resisted, a future secured. It was a different kind of high than the fleeting thrill of a new purchase, but it was deeper, more sustaining. Hope, a cautious, hesitant thing, began to unfurl itself in his chest, like a tight fist slowly unclenching. Weeks bled into months. Clayton didn't look different on the surface. He still had the same calloused hands, the lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and early mornings. But there was a new steadiness in his gaze, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He walked with a different posture, less slumped, more upright. One Saturday morning, the old water heater finally gave out. A cold shower and a gush of water through the basement floor, just a few inches, not enough to do serious damage, but enough to prompt a frantic call to a plumber. Before, this would have sent a spike of pure panic through Clayton. Every unexpected expense was a crisis, a scramble. This time he walked down to the basement, assessed the damage with a calm that surprised even himself, and called a reputable company. When they quoted the price, he didn't flinch. He just nodded, pulled out his debit card, and paid. No stress, no strained conversation with Sarah about where they'd find the money. He had it. He had actually planned for it. That evening, as Sarah put the kids to bed, she found him in the living room, a mug of tea steaming in his hands. She sat beside him on the worn sofa. "You know," she began softly, "I've been watching you, Clay. You're different, less wound up." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, the worry lines around his mouth eased into a genuine, relaxed smile. "It's easier somehow," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "When you know you got a little bit put away, it changes things. It really does." A few months later, Emily came home from school with a flyer for another trip. This one was to the state capital, a 2-day excursion. Her eyes, usually so bright, held that familiar flicker of apprehension as she handed it to him, like she was bracing herself for bad news. Clayton took the paper, his gaze lingering on the price. He smiled at her. "Looks interesting, Em. Go tell your mom to help you pack. I'll make sure the deposit gets sent in." Emily's face lit up, a pure, unadulterated joy that made his own heart swell. He walked over to his small, chipped desk, pulled out his laptop, and transferred the funds, not from an emergency fund, but from a dedicated savings account he'd quietly built up. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was a fulfillment. He saw that drill set again in a flyer for a hardware store that week. It was on sale, the same model he'd almost bought that first difficult day. He held the flyer in his hand, looked at the picture, and felt nothing. No pang of desire, no urge to acquire. It was just a tool. He tossed the flyer into the recycling bin. He had what he needed. And what he needed wasn't a new gadget. It was the security of knowing his family was taken care of, the quiet power of making a choice for their future instead of his own fleeting fancy. The taste of that certainty, that peace of mind, was sweeter than any fleeting pleasure a new toy could ever provide. He was the same Clayton in the same small house, working the same factory job. But he saw the world through new eyes, and the world in turn felt like a different place. That feeling, that quiet certainty, began to spread, not just through him, but into the very air of their little home. Sarah noticed first, of course. She always did. One evening, she sat opposite him at the kitchen table, the kids finally asleep. He was going over the bills, not with his old furrowed brow and tight jaw, but with a calm, methodical focus, a pen making steady ticks on paper. "You're different, Clay," she said, her voice soft, not accusing, just observing. You're not so wound up anymore. He looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. Am I? He hadn't realized how much his internal struggle had shown. Yeah. Like a weight's been lifted, the way you handled Emily's trip, and you haven't bought a new tool in months. She chuckled. I half expected you to come home with that new power washer you were looking at last week. He put the pen down. I realized I didn't need it. We have one. It works. The money's better off, elsewhere. He didn't elaborate on the elsewhere, yet not fully, not until he was sure this wasn't just a fleeting change. But the truth was, elsewhere was the bank, the investment account he'd finally opened, the quiet, growing hum of their future taking shape. The shift wasn't a sudden earthquake, but more like the slow, undeniable pull of the tide. Days turned into weeks, then months. The disciplined no became less a battle and more a reflex. He still worked the same long hours, his hands still bore the same calluses, his shoulders still ached from the same repetitive motions. But the grind no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a purposeful effort. Each hour he put in wasn't just another hour closer to quitting time, but another hour building something substantial. His worry, that dull ache in his gut, had begun to recede, replaced not by extravagance but by a quiet confidence. When the old water heater finally gave out, gushing rusty water all over the utility room, Clayton didn't panic. He called a plumber, got quotes, and calmly paid for the replacement from a dedicated home repair fund he'd started. No desperate scramble, no tense whispers with Sarah about maxing out a credit card. Just a problem and a solution. Emily and Josh, oblivious to the years of silent financial dread their parents had carried, just saw a new, shiny water heater appear as if by magic. He remembered a conversation with one of the older guys at the plant, a grizzled veteran named Frank who had always seemed to possess an unshakable calm. It ain't about how much you make, Clay, Frank had once told him, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. It's about what you do with what you make. Most folks, they got a hole in their pocket. Soon as it comes in, it's gone. Clayton had heard him then, but hadn't truly listened. Now Frank's words echoed with a profound truth. Clayton wasn't just filling the hole, he was building a wall. 5 years passed. 5 years of saying no to the immediate want for the long-term need. No new truck, though his old one rattled a bit more. No fancy vacations, though they did take more weekend trips to state parks, packing lunches and making memories that didn't cost a fortune. No extravagant gifts, just thoughtful ones. The small, dated house remained, but the mortgage was shrinking faster than he'd ever thought possible. The kids' college funds, once just a distant hope, were now tangible, growing accounts. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah handed him the latest bank statement. Her eyes, instead of apprehension, held a kind of awe. The numbers, bold and undeniable, represented more than just money. They represented freedom. The freedom from stress, the freedom to choose, the freedom to simply be without the constant hum of financial anxiety in the background. Clayton looked at the statement, then out the window at the modest life they had built. He saw Emily, now 19, away at her first year of college, a dream he'd once thought impossible. He saw Josh, 15, already talking about engineering, his future bright and unburdened. He saw Sarah, her face softer, her laughter more frequent, the worry lines around her eyes significantly lessened. He hadn't bought a yacht, hadn't quit his job to travel the world, but he had bought peace. He had bought security. He had bought his family a future. And in his eyes, that was a wealth far beyond mere dollars. He leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over him like a warm blanket. You know, he said to Sarah, his voice low, thoughtful, most folks want it now. New truck, new TV, whatever. And that now feeling, it fades, fast. It's like eating a candy bar when you're truly hungry. Tastes good for a second, but it don't fill you up. He paused, looking around their familiar, comforting home. What don't fade, though, is knowing you got a roof over your head, knowing there's food on the table, and knowing your kids got a shot at whatever they want to be without having to start from behind. That's the stuff that lasts. That's the real meal. He looked at her, his eyes steady, full of a hard-won wisdom. You gotta learn to want that tomorrow more than you want that today. That's the real payoff. That's where true gratification comes from. And he was right. Clayton, the factory man, the quiet stoic, hadn't chased a get-rich-quick scheme. He hadn't gambled or gotten lucky. He'd simply chosen tomorrow, day after day, year after year.